We are now going to hear from Amanda Reid, who's a senior researcher at the Business and Economic Research Limited, commonly known as BERL. She has a Master of Philosophy on the Measurement of Wellbeing from AUT. She is interested in wellbeing enablers and the connection between the subjective wellbeing of individuals and the social wellbeing of public and private institutions and communities. Her key areas of work at BERL are the Maori economy, including Indigenous trade and strengths-based Maori futures, and work-based issues, including workforce development, strategies, understanding retention and attrition, workforce wellbeing, and the value of diversity. As part of BERL's partnership with the Helen Clark Foundation, Amanda wrote Engage Communities, How Community-Led Development Can Increase Civic Participation. She's on the board of Dress for Success in Wellington and was previously on the board of Trade Aid New Zealand. Welcome, Amanda.
Kia ora tātou, i ngā mana, i ngā reo, i ngā iwi, e rau rangatira mā, nau mai, haere mai, piki mai, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Amanda Reid toku ingoa, no Rotorua hau, he mahi ana au hei kai rangahau ki BERL. So I'm Amanda, I'm a senior researcher at BERL. I'm the non-economist, although my colleagues would call me a closet economist. Mostly because of my obsession with social capital, social cohesion, social participation. So engagement is one of those terms that can be a little bit ambiguous. For me, it reminds me of words like sustainability and organic, where it means different things to different people and in different contexts. So we've got lots of different people talking today about some of those contexts. So really this is partly about the work that I did with Helen Clark, but also partly about the work that I've done day to day about, so it's just a few bits and pieces that might be helpful. It's difficult to talk about these really deep topics in a short period of time. So, okay, point it at you. Woo, yes, here we go. Here's my hobby horse, social capital. So capital is a word that economists and accountants use to describe something that is an asset. And social capital is a community asset. It belongs to and is contributed to by the communities. And it is social connection, it is attitude, it is norms, it is values, and it is social cohesion. It's everything that we consider when we talk about things like social well-being. So it's the glue that holds people and communities together. It's whakawhanaungatanga, our extended whānau relationships, tūranga waiwai, a sense of belonging and inclusion, and manaakitanga, which is our care and generosity for the people around us. It is also tiakitanga, which is trust, which globally is at record lows. So in government, social capital is considered in local government, in the Local Government Community Wellbeing Amendment Act 2019, which brought social wellbeing and community wellbeing back on local government agenda after kind of being absent for a few years, with fiscal accountability being the primary priority. In central government, it's part of the Living Standards framework, although I'd argue it's the least well-measured capital, mostly because the framework is adapted from an OECD model, which is Eurocentric. It struggles to deal with what do you do with cultural wellbeing and cultural capital. And it doesn't know really how to take collective values into account. By and large, Treasury struggles to identify meaningful indicators for social capital, and there's an over-reliance on a couple of different Statistics New Zealand surveys which are done biannually. As Professor Spooner has identified, government doesn't often know what to do with social capital. So it's a general social survey which contributes to some of the social capital measures within the Living Standards framework, which includes trust in others, which incidentally in Aotearoa had decreased 2.5 percentage points from 2014 to 2018. Kia ora. So for businesses and the community sector, social capital is about your social licence to operate. So we hear a lot about social licence. We've had some pretty big failures of social licence, just our neighbours across the ditch with the Jukin Gorge, the 46,000-year-old Aboriginal caves, which were destroyed by Rio Tinto, which kind of lost their social capital, their social licence to operate. So social licence is your level of support, approval or acceptance of your organisation and its activities, its operations, its people within the areas that you are working in. And that's both internal stakeholders with your employees as well as external stakeholders such as consumers, clients, communities. So social licence of businesses is a bit intangible. You don't see it on a balance sheet, but you know when you've lost it and you know when you have it. It has very tangible bottom line consequences. The 2020 Edelman Trust Barometer report showed that ethical drivers such as integrity, dependability and purpose drove 76% of trust capital of businesses, with competence only accounting for 24%. So it's not just about how good you are at what you do. It's like, are you perceived as being ethical, trustworthy? Are you perceived as being accountable to those people who you consider your stakeholders? So fundamentally, social capital is about people and it is about relationships, and building and maintaining social capital is really the why of good engagement. So as part of the report that Tracy mentioned that I did for the Helen Clark Foundation, we were looking at community-led development and rather at looking at how can you do policies to make people vote more. It's like, what happens if the community's actually really engaged, if they feel heard, if they feel like they belong, if they feel like actually their voice matters. And as part of that, we identified 3 different types of communities. There are many more types. This is just the 3 types that we identified as part of this report, which was aimed at local government, but it has pretty broad applicability. And these communities were community of place, community of interest, and community of identity. So we're going to talk a little bit more about these 3 different types, but people are part of more than one type of community, so you can't just kind of squish people into a box and say we have identified this group, but we're more likely to strongly identify with particular communities at different points in our life, depending on what matters to us at that time. So communities of place, sometimes called spatial communities. These are communities defined by a geographic boundary, by a geographic location. People may work, live, socialise, go to schools, engage in recreation activities, shop, do all sorts of different things within a community of place. But the location is what brings everyone together, with varying levels of interaction and assortment of beliefs and values. Now, when I think of places like Wellington, where you've got people coming in from Kapiti, people coming in from the hut, from Wairarapa to work, but they're not often considered when it comes to engagement within Wellington, because engagement happens with ratepayers. And people in the hut and Kapiti don't pay rates, but actually they're part of this community of place as well, because it's where they work every single day. So communities of place are relevant in lots of different contexts, but to organisations that operate within specific geographic boundaries, whether it's a community sector offering a particular social service, whether it's an iwi that's attached to a takiwā o rohe. Communities of place can be the default community in engagement because it's kind of easier to kind of see in a way. And the next is a community of interest. So communities of interest are brought together by a shared interest, such as housing, art, sport, the environment. So members of this type of community may live in a range of different places. They may engage in a range of different ways, like online, or come together as a group for their shared interest. They may be organised into a formal structure, or it may be a more loose kind of collective. But as a collective, they can draw attention to a common problem or interest, and if driven to action, they can strongly advocate to seek solutions about change. So social movements are often community of interest, and the School Kids for Climate Change, I would say, is a community of interest, because it's children across the world and across Aotearoa who their unifying point in their community is that they want to see a change in the world that they live in. Communities of identity. So this is often what we are talking about when we're considering diversity. So communities of identity are brought together by common affiliations or experiences. Identity may be a specific personal feature. Often things that people consider demographics and statistics are community of identity attributes, such as ethnicity, gender, hapu, sexuality, age, religion, and others might be situational, such as someone caring for elderly relatives, or being homeless, or being a refugee or migrant. So you have a shared experience. So communities formed around people actively involved with an aspect of their identity can create safe spaces to discuss concerns, that's like peer networks, and to receive shared understanding and support from peers. So these communities can be informal or formal. Communities of identity can also exist within sub-communities. So you have a hapu or iwi within a town or a region, or rainbow youth within a sports community. So that's a community of identity within a community of interest. But when we're talking about communities of identity, we're talking about effective and meaningful diversity, equity, and inclusion. So consideration of diversity is essential, it's crucial in any kind of service decision, in any kind of workforce practices, community development, advocacy in designing built environments and public spaces. And inclusion is the partner to diversity, and it's recognising that differences are our strengths, really. So being inclusive requires intentionally building in access and equity and participation, but most importantly, anything around diversity and inclusion should be co-designed with the community of identity they seek to include. You can't tell another community how they should feel included or what equity looks like when it's not from their perspective. And this includes things like social procurement and social investment. So for communities of identity, and May kind of talked about it a bit, cultural competency and representation are major issues. The number of communities of identity that I talk with that talked about transaction fatigue, do a lot of work with Māori entities, and they are consulted out. And then the same with migrant communities. They get their voice harvested and then nothing happens with it. But also communities of identity frequently do not see themselves represented in decision-making bodies. And if they don't see that, there's a real high risk of disengagement. So we hear a lot about the disengagement of communities of identity because they've given their voice, they've given their opinion, it hasn't been heard, nothing's happened, nothing has changed, and this has happened year upon year upon year. So there's a saying that comes from mental health sector called "nothing about us without us," which has become a pretty universal kind of saying, which kind of conveys the concept of decisions being made with the full and direct participation of communities that are affected by these decisions. This applies to diversity of people within communities of all types and how they're represented and how they are consulted or engaged with. It means not coming in with solutions, being prepared to not have a solution before you land there, but working with communities and building trusted relationships, which is that social capital we talked about earlier. So communities trust organisations when the trust and partnership is reciprocal and their contributions are valued. And just a kind of a mention here of technology, because technology can play a crucial role in keeping communities connected and engaged. Who here has had Zoom meetings? It's part of their work, part of their whānau. Yeah, Zoom cocktails seem to form part of my lockdown. And so we see how technology can facilitate connection where kanohi ki te kanohi, like face-to-face, is not possible. So social media and the internet can be used to mobilise, to inspire, to share up-to-date and relevant information and resources, and to organise events and gatherings. Information can get out quickly and different channels can reach different audiences. But as May said, you need to make sure that the channels that you are using are reaching the community that you are hoping to reach. We often default with, it's kind of like everyone goes to Seek and Trade Me for a job. Who knows if the person that you're wanting to hire is actually looking at those channels. But the way we engage with communities has changed with the increasing prevalence and diversity of the technology that's available, and it's kind of quite rapid. 20 years ago, gathering community opinion was still door-to-door and still involved things like town hall kind of meetings. As most town halls and small rural areas are no longer used, maybe just for 21st. However, most people these days, or many people, have access to a platform and an opportunity to have a voice, so the possibilities for engagement have increased exponentially, and we need to think differently about how we use technology in this way. I had a project this year with a government department who pre-COVID, we were looking at focus groups. During COVID, focus groups were not possible. They wanted to move them online, but online focus groups is like 4 people. You need to be able to see each other on a screen, and having 30 faces on a screen doesn't increase engagement. So we moved to discussion boards, which were more like Facebook, and the engagement was phenomenal. But we had to shift from thinking around it has to be a focus group, but online. Sometimes it doesn't translate that kind of well. But increased internet availability and mobile use. Like if you've got great stuff on your website, but it's really text heavy and people have to scroll on a phone, you're going to lose them. It's not going to be effective kind of information. But everyone has, if they've got a phone and they've got some data, or they can connect into Wi-Fi, they have access to all sorts of information. We're in a data economy, data heavy world. Lots of information and no wisdom, or some wisdom. So this growth means that people can participate in engagement regardless of timing, regardless of location. They can do it when it fits with them, or no matter where they are, in any kind of online survey or accessing information through e-newsletters. So it can be more efficient than offline methods, but not necessarily more effective. So while you can reach large numbers of people with online technology forms, it can become a little bit transactional and maybe a little bit one-sided, because it's easy to just push information out and assume that it's getting to the right place. So the act of information sharing in itself does not build trust, particularly if the information is selective, with glaring omissions or inaccurate. And informing is not the only part of community engagement. So being innovative means looking at community engagement through kind of a wider lens, and looking at it through the lens of trust. Like, how is this going to be received by people? Are people going to trust you more? Are you actually building a relationship across technology? And as May said, consider whether the channels you're using to connect with the communities are the right channels. But also consider digital exclusion. You need to kind of, if you are putting something out on a website, how are those that are digitally excluded? Those people who choose or are unable to access digital media, how will you make sure that you have offline channels for that engagement and information sharing as well? So that's about the accessibility. I did flash things with transitions and can't remember what I did. So this is a pyramid of engagement, a little bit kind of adapted from a ladder of engagement. Mostly for me, as being quite a visual person, it helps me to see the weighting of kind of the effort or resources. So fundamentally, engagement should or is about relationships, not about data and information. An authentic community and stakeholder engagement at its core is about building social capital. So the one at the bottom is inform. You can see that's about you tell communities what is to happen. This is a one-way pushing out of information. That's when you get a flyer in your letterbox about the roadworks that are going to change your road for the next 6 months or whatever. Consultation, it's a word that's used a lot. It's also a one-way flow of information. So it can be quite extractive, but it's about collecting information, asking for views. So this is like, you know, surveys or focus groups. They are consultation. The result of consultation may not be binding, so there's no real decision-making power behind consultation. So it's information in, information out. So the first two, this inform and consult, are frequently the tools of engagement. But as you can see, there's quite one way and there's no relationship building, but they're often quicker. You can put an article up on a website, you can print some flyers and post them out, put an ad in a newspaper. So involve is where relationships start to be developed. It's about working with communities, those three different types of communities we talked about, to include their issues and their concerns in the process. So it's like you're asking them, well, what do you want? How do you see this happening? So it's a little bit more than just asking for opinion. Next one up is collaboration. So this is around partnering with communities affected or impacted by decisions and considering issues and identifying preferred options. It requires considerably more resources, but tends to have considerably higher buy-in. When I think about things like engagement, I remember how my nana told me that when in the 1800s, when Māori were like, we need to, you know, get into this king movement because we've noticed Pākehā listen to a sovereign, they have a leader. It took 13 years of hui all around the country for a Māori king. That's 13 years of hui. That is collaboration at its deepest level. We're lucky to get 13 weeks of consultation in most projects. And finally, empower. Empower is where this is like citizen-led participation, where the final decision is placed in the hands of communities. You're offering it back out to them. So each level of engagement is appropriate at different times for different decisions. And the appropriateness of different engagement levels really is dependent on your organisational restrictions, which could be fiscal or legal. But you absolutely need to be clear about the benefits and deficiencies of each level when you're considering engagement strategies. And if you do have time restrictions or resource restrictions, just name it, be open about it. We know that we're doing this, but you know, it's better to be clear and acknowledge than do what I'd like to call a faux consultation. I used to work in mental health, and that's why I now work in research, but the number of faux consultations I was a part of where whānau and people experiencing mental distress would come to hui with the assumption that what they were saying would make a change in decision, and it never did. And they were just, you know, heartbroken time after time. You don't want people walking away from your engagement heartbroken. So this, I guess, is a wee kind of case study point as it is on the agenda. So how does this kind of work in practice? So as an economics and research consultancy, we're contracted to solve problems. Sometimes a client has an idea of the answer and they want us to prove their answer, but sometimes they only know what the problem is and they want support in finding the solution. So we have a long history of working with and for Māori entities. We're involved in the initiation of the Federation of Māori Authorities, which is FOMA. And over the past few years, we've worked extensively with Ngāi Tahu on a series of projects on Māori futures. So Ngāi Tahu is a community of place, being based largely in the South Island in Te Waipounamu. They're also a community of interest because there are different groups within Te Runganga o Ngāi Tahu are focused on different areas, so the environment or kaitiakitanga. And they're definitely a community of identity, because anyone that whakapapas to Ngāi Tahu, as with any hapu or iwi, identifies really strongly as I am Ngāi Tahu or Kai Tahu, regardless of where they live in the world or where they live in the country. So the work that we've been doing with Ngāi Tahu has been looking at education and employment as pathways to economic empowerment. And traditionally, this type of problem will have involved a lot of data, like, looking at everything in the census, a lot of analysis and some recommendations. Often people come to us and it's like, here's the scope, how are you going to do it? Here's a contract, send us a draft. That is not how we work with Ngāi Tahu. We don't have a fully formed scope when we start. We start with an idea of a problem that they themselves have identified. We're not telling them what the data is telling us. They're telling us what is important to them and what their aspirations are, and what can we find that supports them in what their aspirations are. So it's changed the dial on a lot of our other projects, but these are fully collaborative projects. They're very iterative. We don't really have a project governance as such. We just have open doors. I think my manager is meeting with someone for breakfast at 7 o'clock this morning. That's how the door is quite open. If they're here, we're having a coffee with them. But it means that we're building a long-lasting relationship. It's not just here's a contract with a scope for a deliverable. It's quite a different way of working in a consultancy. But it's also about how can our skills add value to what Ngāi Tahu is wanting, rather than us telling them what they should be doing, we as experts. So what we are expert in is interpreting data and finding data to support where they want to go. Means exploratory and iterative co-design processes where we just report back what we've found. We undertake some sense making about what that means. Any research we do, we provide the data back to them. So behind these 4 pieces of mahi here, which have been done over 2 or 3 years, there are massive technical documents which we have provided back to them for their own use, for their own strategy, as opposed to just, we don't have discussions about IP, because data about people is their data. So we've given it back to them and provided some analysis for them to help them kind of make their decisions. And we take the lead from them about what's valuable, where they want to go next, both within a project and from project to project. We don't go in and do interviews or qualitative kind of analysis. What we do is we do capability building so that they can go in and do rangatahi workshops and ask the rangatahi what they need, as opposed to me coming in and asking. So it's quite a different way of working. But at the foundation, there is accountability and there is trust. We're accountable to them and they trust us. We're clear about the community that we're working within, and we're clear about what levels of engagement are appropriate at different times that add value to the relationship. And when to inform, when to consult, when to involve, when to collaborate and empower, but mostly where we're at is the collaborating and empowering. So I guess that's my takeaway today. Know who you're engaging with and know what type of engagement is appropriate for the community that you're within. Don't come in as the expert of knowing all the things. You know some things, but how can you share together to get the best kind of end result? That's it.
Amanda, that was fantastic. I can imagine you never leaving, Bill, because it sounds like you absolutely love your job and the people that you work with. We have time for one question. Just looking around, does anyone have a question?
It's on? Cool. Hi, I'm Rob from Community Living in the Waikato.
Kia ora.
Here with my boss, Claire. You said that you've worked in the mental health field. I was wondering, in that field, do you have any specific thoughts around engagement there? I'm reasonably new to the job, and anything at all would be cool.
I guess my one thought is be really clear on the purpose. Know the kaupapa of why you are asking for engagement. If you know why, then you can and what you're going to do with the information. Because it's a taonga. When people give their experience to you, that's still theirs and it's a precious gift. What are you going to do with it? So if you think about it as a taonga, then you treat it quite differently. So ask for someone's voice when you're really sure you're going to do something with it. And that don't promise what you can't deliver. That's it. I see teas and coffees and things there. I'm going to move sideways. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Cheers.